Before sunrise, the border didn't just wake up. It erupted. Iraqi artillery thundered across the Iran-Iraq frontier so suddenly and violently that the sky looked as if it had exploded open. The first shells landed before most Iranian soldiers were even out of bed. What had been weeks of rising tension turned into a full-scale war in a matter of seconds, one that neither country was truly prepared for, yet both were about to be consumed by. In Washington, thousands of miles away, 29-year-old CIA analyst Michael Turner sat hunched over a dimly lit desk. His shift was almost over. He was expecting another quiet morning of routine monitoring, maybe a few field reports from embassy staff in the region. Instead, the radar feed lit up with fast-moving signatures racing across the Iran-Iraq border. At first he thought it was a glitch. Then another wave appeared. Then another. Jets. Lots of them. Michael leaned closer, eyes locked on the rapidly updating screen. More alerts rolled in: artillery strikes, troop movements, armored columns. This wasn't a border probe. It was coordinated, massive, and unmistakably planned. Iraq wasn't testing Iran. Iraq was invading it. Across the ocean in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein, then 43 years old, watched his generals move markers across a large operations map. His posture was rigid, his confidence unshakable. For months he had convinced himself, and his inner circle, that Iran was weak. The 1979 revolution had ripped apart Iran's old military command. The Shah's top generals were jailed or executed. Experienced officers had fled the country. Saddam saw chaos where there had once been order, and he believed it created a perfect opening. Oil, power, territory, Saddam wanted all of it. And he believed Khuzestan, Iran's oil-rich southwest province, rightfully belonged to Iraq. In his mind, he was not starting a reckless war. He was reclaiming what was his. At 7 a.m. Baghdad time, Iraqi jets roared into Iranian airspace. Their mission was clear: cripple Iran's air power before it could respond. Pilots targeted runways, aircraft shelters, radar stations, and fuel depots. Dust and flames rose from airbases near Ahvaz, Dezful, and Tehran. Saddam expected the strikes to shock Iran into paralysis. On the ground, Iraqi armored divisions surged toward Khuzestan. The tanks pushed forward in tight lines, Soviet-made T-55s and T-62s, along with new T-72s Saddam had proudly purchased. Dozens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers marched behind them, ready for a fight they believed would be short. But 90 miles away, in a rundown Iranian barracks near Abadan, Reza Moradi, a 21-year-old conscript with barely 6 months of training, jolted awake as the ground shook violently under him. Dust fell from the ceiling. Someone yelled his name. Another soldier rushed through the doorway shouting that Iraq was attacking. Reza wasn't ready for this. None of them were. Iran had been rebuilding after its revolution. The new government was still purging officers loyal to the Shah. The military command chain was fractured. Ammunition was low. Training was inconsistent. Most soldiers, like Reza, had never even imagined a war on this scale. He stumbled outside into chaos. Smoke rose in the distance. Trucks raced toward the front. Officers shouted conflicting orders. The air smelled of oil and burning metal. For a moment Reza froze, unsure of where to go or what to do. Then another explosion hit nearby, shaking him back into motion. He grabbed his rifle, joined a cluster of soldiers, and prepared for a day he knew might be his last. By midday, back in Washington, Michael Turner had enough data to know Iraq was not bluffing. The scale of the invasion shocked even seasoned analysts. He briefed his supervisor, who immediately escalated the findings up the chain. The U.S. wasn't ready to take sides, but it needed information fast. Satellites were redirected. Embassies were contacted. Intelligence teams prepared rapid updates. The region was shifting, and the world's major powers were watching closely. Saddam believed his offensive would crush Iran quickly. He expected Iran's leadership, still struggling to stabilize after overthrowing the Shah, to collapse under pressure. He believed Iranian soldiers would flee. He believed the people of Khuzestan, many of whom spoke Arabic, would welcome Iraqi troops as liberators. But by late morning, cracks began to appear in Saddam's assumptions. Instead of collapsing, Iran's remaining commanders scrambled to reorganize. Local defense units formed makeshift battle lines. Officers who had been sidelined after the revolution returned to their posts. Civilians volunteered to help move supplies. Even in chaos, Iran's response grew stronger by the hour. In Ahvaz, Reza Moradi and dozens of other soldiers were ordered to hold a key road leading into the city. They dug into shallow positions, using sandbags, broken concrete, and anything else they could find. The sun beat down on them. Tanks rumbled in the distance. Every few minutes, another explosion echoed closer. Reza gripped his rifle tightly, heart pounding. He remembered his training, what little he had. He reminded himself that his family lived only a few miles away. If he ran, Iraqi tanks would reach them. That thought alone kept him from breaking. As the day went on, word spread among Iranian units that the attack was much larger than anyone expected. Entire Iraqi divisions were moving into Khuzestan. Iraqi jets kept striking airbases and major roads. Communications were spotty, but despite the chaos, resistance hardened. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, Saddam's generals brought him early reports. They told him the airstrikes had hit most of their targets. They assured him Iranian defenses were weak. They reported that Iranian commanders were confused. Everything they claimed was on schedule. But they also delivered something Saddam didn't expect: evidence of stubborn Iranian resistance. Some Iraqi tank columns encountered fierce firefights. Some bridges were destroyed before they could be crossed. Iranian troops, poorly trained and poorly equipped, were refusing to retreat. Saddam frowned at those reports. He dismissed them as minor delays. But deep down, he began to feel the first hints of doubt. By late afternoon, Michael Turner was staring at incoming satellite images showing smoke plumes rising across multiple Iranian cities. He also saw something else: clusters of Iranian forces regrouping in ways analysts had not predicted. Iran was not collapsing. It was adjusting. Back in Khuzestan, Reza and his units survived multiple artillery strikes. They were exhausted, scared, and unsure of what the next hour would bring. But they held their position. When rumors spread that more Iraqi armor was approaching, Reza braced himself again. He expected to die, but he refused to run. As evening set in, the battlefield looked nothing like what Saddam had imagined. Iraqi forces advanced, but slower than planned. Key objectives were still out of reach. Iranian forces, though battered, continued to fight. The war Saddam expected to win in days was already showing signs of dragging into something far more brutal. And by nightfall, Iraq realized Iran's resistance wouldn't collapse as easily as Saddam had promised. Saddam believed the war would last a week, maybe less. That confidence filled every room inside Baghdad's presidential palace on the first day of the invasion. But even before the sun rose on day one, the first cracks in his plan were already showing. Inside the palace, Saddam stood over a large operations map. Red arrows sliced deep into Iranian territory, pointing toward the oil-rich province of Khuzestan and the major cities he expected to seize quickly. He was 43, powerful, and convinced the world would soon see Iraq as the Middle East's dominant state. He told his senior commanders that Iran's new government was weak. The revolution had gutted its officer corps. The new leadership was distracted by internal struggles. Saddam believed all of this gave him an easy path to victory. Across the ocean, in a secure CIA room in Washington, General Sam Peterson, a 58-year-old intelligence advisor, reviewed intercepted radio communications. He watched Iraqi battlefield reports appear on the screen. He shook his head and turned to 29-year-old analyst Michael Turner. "He's overconfident," Peterson muttered. "He thinks he's fighting a broken country." But Iran wasn't breaking. On the ground near the border, Iraqi soldiers marched into towns expecting locals to welcome them. Iraqi propaganda had told them the people of Khuzestan were waiting for liberation. Instead, they found armed resistance in the streets. Groups of Iranian volunteers, some teenagers, some older men with minimal training, rushed out from homes, fields, and abandoned checkpoints to defend their villages. In the city of Khorramshahr, Colonel Amir Rahimi, a veteran Iranian officer in his mid-40s, took command of scattered, disorganized troops. Many of the men had never fought in a real battle before. But Rahimi knew the terrain. He knew how to use narrow streets and damaged buildings as defensive positions. He moved quickly, gathering soldiers, assigning perimeters, and blocking Iraqi tanks from advancing too far too fast. His leadership slowed the Iraqi push. It wasn't enough to stop the invasion, but it was enough to frustrate Iraqi field commanders who had promised Saddam quick victories. Meanwhile, back inside the palace, optimism was fading. Saddam's generals brought him early updates. Some towns had fallen, but not all. Some bridges had been taken, but others remained contested. Multiple Iraqi units reported unexpected firefights with groups of volunteers they referred to as local militias. Saddam didn't like what he heard. He slammed his palm against the table and demanded faster results. He wanted decisive victories to show the Arab world that Iraq was the rightful leader of the region. Every delay wounded his pride. Every stalled offensive made him angrier. But anger couldn't speed up a battlefield. Iraqi units strained to push deeper into Iran, but resistance grew. Iranian volunteers dug trenches, built barricades, and held intersections. Some carried old rifles. Some had almost no armor. Yet they fought with a determination Saddam had not predicted. General Peterson watched new intelligence reports come in. He saw patterns the Iraqi leadership refused to acknowledge. Iran wasn't acting like a collapsing state. It was acting like a country bracing for a long war. He miscalculated, Peterson said quietly. Michael Turner didn't answer. He knew it too. As the day went on, the world stared in confusion. Iraqi diplomats insisted the operation was only an effort to restore rightful borders. Iranian officials called it an unprovoked invasion. News networks broadcast conflicting statements. Analysts debated who started what. No one had a clear picture. But something important was happening beneath the noise. Across Khuzestan, small groups of Iranian fighters, soldiers, volunteers, even local police, began forming coordinated units. They shared ammunition. They relayed messages through old radios. They created homemade roadblocks. Each town fought in its own way, but all were united by one idea: Iran would not surrender. These scattered pockets of resistance grew as more volunteers arrived from nearby cities. Some drove old pickup trucks. Some rode bicycles. Some arrived on foot. All carried whatever they could: grenades, rifles, pistols, even farming tools turned into weapons. They didn't care about odds. They cared about protecting their homes. Colonel Rahimi saw this movement forming and worked to guide it. He understood that these volunteers, though barely trained, could give Iran something it desperately needed: time. Every hour Iraq failed to capture key objectives allowed Iranian commanders in Tehran to regroup and plan. Every delay weakened Saddam's gamble. By late afternoon, word reached Baghdad of more stalled progress. Saddam's face hardened as he heard the reports. He paced the room, demanding explanations. His generals blamed terrain. They blamed communication failures. They blamed Iranian fanatics. No one dared to admit the truth. Iran simply refused to collapse. And that single fact threatened Saddam's entire strategy. His invasion plan depended on speed. A fast victory would break Iran's government before it could organize. A slow one gave Iran time to fight back. In quiet corners of Khuzestan, something else was taking shape. Small Iranian units began scouting Iraqi positions. Others gathered explosives to sabotage roads. A few groups coordinated nighttime movements. These weren't just acts of defense anymore. They were the early steps of something bigger, a counterattack no one expected so early in the war. Saddam had planned every arrow on his map. He had planned every strike, every advance, every announcement to the Arab world. But he had not planned for this. He had not planned for an Iran that refused to break. The Iraqi Air Force believed the skies belonged to them. Their commanders had promised Saddam that Iran's air power would be wiped out in the first hours of the war. The plan looked bold on paper. The strategy even mirrored Israel's 1967 surprise attack, a move that had stunned the world. Saddam wanted that same glory. He wanted headlines praising Iraq's lightning victory. He wanted Iran's airbases turned into burning craters before its pilots could even climb into their cockpits. At dawn on day 1, waves of Iraqi jets roared across the border. They targeted Iran's biggest airbases, Mehrabad near Tehran, Tabriz in the north, Dezful and Bushehr in the south. Explosions lit up runways. Fuel depots burned. Hangars collapsed under direct hits. Iraqi pilots sent triumphant messages back to their commanders. They believed the mission had worked. They believed Iran's air force was out of the fight. But Saddam had missed something. Something big. Many of Iran's best pilots, especially those trained to fly the advanced F-14 Tomcat, had not been purged after the revolution. They were still in Iran. Still loyal. Still experts at flying one of the most powerful fighter jets in the world. Saddam thought they were out of action. He thought the F-14 fleet had been grounded. He thought Iran lacked the parts and technicians to keep these jets flying. He was wrong. Thousands of miles away, CIA analyst David Collins, 27 years old, watched early battlefield footage in a secure intelligence room. His eyes widened. "They're still flying," he said. On screen, Iranian fighters that Iraq believed destroyed were streaking back into the sky, some damaged, some scorched by shrapnel, but airborne and ready to fight. At Bushehr Air Base, chaos turned into controlled urgency. Young technicians, some barely 20 years old, raced across the tarmac. They dragged fuel lines. They patched bullet holes in wings. They replaced smashed cockpit glass with whatever they had. Every working jet mattered. Every working jet meant Iran could still fight back. Colonel Amir Rahimi, the same officer fighting in Khuzestan, coordinated with Bushehr's ground defense teams. His role expanded quickly. He wasn't just guiding infantry anymore. He was helping secure radar stations, anti-aircraft batteries, and runway repair crews. He made sure Iranian pilots had a chance to take off. Inside one of Bushehr's makeshift briefing rooms, Iranian pilots studied maps lit by emergency lamps. Some were veterans in their late 30s. Others were young recruits who had never seen combat. But all of them shared the same mission: keep Iran in the air. Among them was a pilot known only by his call sign, Shadow. He was in his early 30s, quiet, focused, and known for staying calm under pressure. His F-14 Tomcat had been hidden in a hardened shelter that survived the Iraqi strike. Technicians fueled it in record time. Shadow climbed into the cockpit, tightened his harness, and prepared to launch. Minutes later, his jet ripped down the runway and rose into the smoke-filled sky. Across the border near Basra, Iraqi pilots were returning from their morning raid when they spotted unknown blips on their radar screens. They thought the signals were debris or damaged planes. They were wrong again. The blips belonged to Iran's surviving F-14s. The first dogfight of the war erupted over southern Iraq. Within minutes, Shadow locked onto an Iraqi fighter. His missile streaked forward, slamming into its target. A second Iraqi jet fell moments later. Then a third. By the end of the mission, Shadow had shot down multiple enemy aircraft. His voice stayed steady the whole time. Back in Baghdad, Saddam heard the reports. His officers looked uneasy as they delivered the news. The Iranian Air Force was still operational. Worse, its pilots were hitting back with precision. Saddam's jaw tightened. His confidence, so loud and solid days earlier, began to crack. In Washington, General Sam Peterson reviewed updated intelligence and added a blunt note to his report: Iraq underestimated Iran's air resilience. This will prolong the conflict. And he was right. The air war shifted into a deadly back and forth. Iraqi jets struck oil facilities, rail lines, and airports. Iranian fighters launched counterstrikes on Iraqi airbases near Basra, Mosul, and Kirkuk. Neither side gained total control. Both suffered losses. But the shock came from Iran's ability to remain in the fight despite the chaos of the revolution. While jets clashed overhead, civilians on the ground faced the worst of the destruction. Inus, Farah Nazari, a 25-year-old nurse, worked in a crowded clinic-turned-emergency ward. The floors were covered in dust and blood. Patients filled hallways, rooms, and stairwells. Farah moved from one injured person to the next: children cut by broken glass, farmers hit by shrapnel, Families pulled from collapsed homes. Every time the building shook from a distant explosion, Farah paused, steadied herself, and kept working. Outside the clinic, smoke curled into the sky. Sirens echoed through the city. People searched for loved ones. Civilians were paying the price for the air war's growing intensity. Back at Bushehr, pilots prepared for another wave of missions. Technicians kept repairing aircraft damaged earlier in the day. Colonel Rahimi coordinated defensive artillery, making sure Iraqi jets had a harder time hitting the base again. Every hour Iran survived strengthened its position. Every successful flight embarrassed Iraq's leadership. Most intelligence agencies worldwide had expected Iran to collapse. They predicted Iran's air force would be crushed quickly. But the opposite happened. Iran adapted fast. Its pilots flew more missions than analysts believed possible. Its ground crews worked around the clock. Its commanders improvised, repaired, and reorganized. Tehran's leadership watched the battle closely. They realized something important. Iran wasn't just holding the line. It had a chance to push back. If the air force could survive, so could the country. And if it could strike Iraqi bases, maybe Iran could slow the invasion long enough to prepare a ground defense. In secret briefings, Iranian commanders began discussing something bigger than survival. They talked about counterattacks. They talked about regaining territory. They talked about turning Saddam's gamble into Iraq's nightmare. The air war was supposed to break Iran. Instead, it revealed a strength Saddam never considered. And deep inside Tehran, leaders realized they could transform their defense into something far bigger. Iran wasn't just surviving the air war, it was preparing to take the fight back to Saddam's ground forces. Iraq believed Khuzestan would collapse in days, maybe even hours. Saddam's commanders promised him that the province, with its large Arab population, would open its doors to Iraqi troops. They claimed the people there were waiting for liberation. But the moment Iraqi armored divisions crossed the border, that belief shattered. Khuzestan didn't fall. It exploded into resistance. What Saddam expected to be a quick victory became a grinding battle that turned the province into a graveyard of expectations. Across the region, Iranian volunteers streamed toward the front. Farmers left their fields. Students abandoned classrooms. Factory workers grabbed rifles and shovels. Entire towns mobilized overnight. Trenches appeared across farmlands, dug by men who had never held a weapon before. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't wait for reinforcements. They fought because their homes were on the line. 21-year-old Reza Moradi, still shaken from the first day of the invasion, was sent toward Khorramshahr. The city would soon earn a brutal nickname, the City of Blood. Reza joined a desperate defensive line stretching across rubble, broken walls, and abandoned vehicles. He carried an old rifle and a few magazines. Around him, men dug shallow foxholes and built barricades from sandbags, concrete chunks, and twisted metal. Every man knew the Iraqis were coming. They could hear the tanks long before they saw them. When the first Iraqi armored column pushed into the outskirts of Khorramshahr, Iran's defense crumbled in some areas but held in others. Reza and his unit were pushed back street by street. Every intersection became a battlefield. Iraqi commanders expected quick progress, but Iranian snipers held rooftops and hit exposed infantry. Civilians hauled ammunition in wheelbarrows. Teenagers threw Molotov cocktails from alleyways. It wasn't organized warfare. It was survival. From a monitoring post miles away, David Collins watched raw footage streaming in from journalists and satellite data. Dust clouds, fires, tanks advancing into tight streets. It all told a clear story. He turned to a colleague and said quietly, "Iraq expected surrender. They got a nationwide awakening." David understood what the Iraqis didn't. The invasion had united Iran in a way nothing else could have. The chaos of the revolution was gone. The people were now fighting a foreign enemy, and that changed everything. Inside Khuzestan, Colonel Amir Rahimi operated like a man with no time to waste. He moved constantly, south to Abadan, north to Oz, then back to Khorramshahr. He knew Iran couldn't match Iraq tank for tank. So he ordered hit-and-run attacks. Small teams with RPGs ambushed Iraqi armor, then vanished into alleys. Anti-tank units hid in abandoned buildings. Volunteers blocked roadways with debris to slow the advance. Rahimi's strategy was simple: bleed Iraq's momentum dry, 1 kilometer at a time. By the second week, Iraqi frustration grew. Their tanks could break into the city, but holding ground was another story. Buildings became traps. Streets turned into kill zones. Iraqi infantry faced an enemy they didn't expect: civilians who refused to run. Many Iraqi soldiers were shocked. They thought Khuzestan's Arabs would greet them as brothers. Instead, some of those same Arabs were fighting alongside Iranian soldiers. Saddam's assumptions had been wrong from the start. Inside Baghdad's presidential palace, Saddam paced back and forth, furious. Reports of slow progress enraged him. He wanted Khorramshahr captured immediately. He wanted a symbolic victory to show the Arab world Iraq was strong. He demanded more troops, more artillery, more pressure. His generals, already exhausted, nodded and promised results they weren't sure they could deliver. The battle grew uglier. Iraqi tanks rolled through destroyed neighborhoods. Iranian defenders fired from windows and rooftops. Explosions shook buildings already weakened by days of shelling. Smoke covered entire blocks. Reza lost friends in sudden blasts. He barely slept. Every hour brought another firefight. Meanwhile, in a crowded clinic in Os, Farah Nazari faced a nightmare that didn't end. The wounded came in waves: soldiers with shrapnel wounds, volunteers missing limbs, civilians caught in collapsing homes. Supplies ran out quickly. Farah boiled water to sterilize instruments. She tore cloth into makeshift bandages. She used her own scarf to stop the bleeding of a young boy carried in by his father. Exhaustion clung to her, but she kept moving. She had no choice. By the third week, Khorramshahr looked like a city crushed by a storm. Buildings were burned shells. Streets were filled with debris, abandoned vehicles, and bodies covered with sheets. But Iran still fought. Colonel Rahimi coordinated nightly counterattacks to push Iraqi units back a few blocks. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they didn't. But each attack forced Iraq to pay for every inch of ground. Iraqi commanders grew more desperate. They sent more tanks, more infantry, more artillery. They tried to encircle the city. They tried to cut off defenders. Still, the fighting dragged on. What Saddam thought would take days had already dragged into weeks. At CIA headquarters, David Collins analyzed satellite images. He saw smoke rising from the same neighborhoods day after day. He saw Iraqi formations shifting again and again. "They're stuck," he said during a briefing. "They can take the city, but they can't take it fast." And that changes everything. The world began paying attention. Newspapers released photos showing destroyed streets and terrified civilians. Analysts debated whether Iraq had miscalculated. Commentators questioned Saddam's leadership. But on the ground, none of that mattered. For Reza, Rahimi, Farah, and thousands of others, survival was the only goal. As the fourth week began, Iraqi forces launched a massive assault. Tanks pushed deeper than before. Infantry followed closely behind. Snipers were overwhelmed. Iranian defenders ran low on ammunition. Rahimi tried to coordinate a counterattack, but many units were too battered to reposition. Reza and the remaining soldiers near his position fell back, block by block, until there was nowhere left to retreat. After more than a month of brutal fighting, Khorramshahr finally fell. Iraqi soldiers raised their flag over the ruined city. Saddam celebrated the victory loudly. His propaganda machine declared it a triumph. He believed the fall of the city proved Iraq's strength. But the victory came with a cost he didn't expect. Tens of thousands of Iraqi troops were exhausted. Vehicles were damaged. Supplies were stretched thin. The army that Saddam had promised would sweep through Iran quickly was already worn down. The war he said would last days was turning into something far longer and far bloodier. In Tehran, Iranian leaders watched the volunteer response with new eyes. They realized volunteers weren't just scattered pockets of resistance, they were the beginning of a national force. They began forming battalions, training groups, and reorganizing volunteers into a structured fighting body. What had started as chaos was transforming into a movement. one that would soon reshape the war. And as Iraq celebrated its bloody victory, Iran prepared for a counterstrike that would shock the world. While Iraq celebrated its initial advances, a quiet force was growing in Iran's shadow. The first weeks of the invasion had left the country in shock. Cities had burned, villages had been invaded, and thousands of soldiers and civilians had died. Yet amid the chaos, something unexpected was taking shape: organization. Dispersed volunteers, students, farmers, shopkeepers, began answering the call to defend their homeland. Iran, still reeling from the purge of its military after the 1979 revolution, cautiously welcomed these recruits. They were inexperienced, but their numbers and determination gave hope to commanders who had feared total collapse. Colonel Amir Rahimi stood atop a ridge overlooking a makeshift training camp near the Khuzestan front lines. He counted rows of volunteers practicing maneuvers, firing rifles, and building rudimentary fortifications. Many had never held weapons before, but Rahimi saw potential. Ordinary civilians could become a formidable force if properly trained and motivated. He instructed veteran soldiers to oversee drills, teach guerrilla tactics, and instill discipline. Trenches were dug, mock ambushes conducted, and defensive strategies rehearsed. Every day, Iran's chaotic defense grew stronger, more organized. Among the volunteers was Reza Moradi, once a frightened 21-year-old soldier. Now, he trained side by side with civilians who refused to back down. Their courage inspired even seasoned troops. Reza noticed how morale could match the power of artillery. A motivated soldier could hold a position that seemed impossible to defend. With every training exercise, the volunteers' confidence grew, and so did Reza's. Far across the country, Inez, Farah Nazari tended to wounded volunteers returning from drills. Despite exhaustion, they carried a spark of determination. Her clinic, filled with makeshift bandages and boiled water for sterilization, became a symbol of resilience. Nurses, doctors, and civilians worked together to sustain the volunteers. Food, ammunition, and information flowed from towns to front lines, blurring the line between soldier and citizen. Meanwhile, Saddam Hussein remained confident. His generals reported minor resistance. Reports from Baghdad suggested the war would continue smoothly. But intelligence analysts like Michael Turner saw the pattern forming. Scattered resistance was evolving into coordination. Iran's lines were no longer just holding, they were learning, adapting, and preparing to strike. By the end of the first month, makeshift camps had multiplied. Volunteers were forming structured units, learning communication protocols, and practicing counterattacks. Colonel Rahimi oversaw movements with precision, ensuring that when the time came, these civilians-turned-soldiers could hit Iraq where it hurt most. And as the first major wave of volunteers prepared to join the front lines, Iran readied itself for a counterattack that could change the entire course of the war. The world expected Iran to crumble. Reports from Baghdad, intelligence briefings from Washington, and media analyses from Europe all predicted a swift Iraqi victory. But what unfolded was something no one anticipated. The chaos of Iran's early days had transformed into organized defiance. Scattered pockets of volunteers had coalesced into a tidal wave of resistance, a force that grew faster than anyone thought possible. Young men, old men, students, shopkeepers, ordinary civilians driven by determination, marched toward the front lines. Iran called them Basij volunteers, and within weeks, their numbers swelled into the hundreds of thousands. In Tehran, government and military leaders observed this surge with a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. The professional army, still recovering from the post-revolution purges, could no longer be relied on alone. Yet these volunteers fought with a raw, almost uncontainable energy. They dug trenches, set up barricades, and reinforced defensive positions with a speed and enthusiasm that the regular army struggled to match. It became clear, the people themselves were becoming the backbone of Iran's new defense. Colonel Amir Rahimi now commanded a mixed unit. Part professional soldiers, part volunteers, all fiercely motivated. Initially, he doubted their ability to withstand Iraqi armored assaults. Tanks, artillery, and trained infantry seemed overwhelming. But as he observed their discipline, focus, and sheer determination, Rahimi realized something vital. Iran had discovered a new strength. Morale and courage, when organized and channeled, could match firepower in unexpected ways. Among them was Reza Moradi, who had grown from a frightened 21-year-old into a soldier hardened by weeks of combat. Marching with Rahimi's unit toward the outskirts of Ahvaz, he witnessed the transformation firsthand. Volunteers moved in formation, carrying rifles and supplies. Some had homemade armor, others wielded hunting rifles or outdated weapons. Yet their determination compensated for what they lacked in training or firepower. Reza understood that this wasn't just defense anymore, it was preparation for a counterattack. Across the border in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein's confidence wavered. Reports from his generals told of slowing Iraqi advances, repeated ambushes, and rising casualties. The speed and ease he had promised the Arab world was evaporating. Tanks that once rumbled through open fields now faced improvised roadblocks. Streets were lined with snipers. Every step forward was met with resistance that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Saddam's advisors warned him, the war might no longer be over in days. Thousands of miles away, in a secure CIA monitoring station, Michael Turner studied new satellite imagery. Columns of volunteers moving toward the front lines, fresh defensive lines, and increased activity along key routes revealed a dramatic shift. Iran isn't collapsing, he whispered to General Sam Peterson. They're preparing for something big. Both men understood that the situation on the ground was changing faster than anticipated. In Khuzestan, Rahimi's unit maneuvered carefully through ruined villages, abandoned vehicles, and destroyed infrastructure. Volunteers carried ammunition, food, and messages from one sector to another. Their presence allowed the army to consolidate positions, repair breaches in defensive lines, and prepare for a coordinated response. Reza noted how volunteers adapted quickly, following Rahimi's orders and even improvising when the situation demanded. They learned to use the terrain, narrow alleys, canals, and farmland as defensive advantages. When Iraqi patrols appeared, the volunteers were ready to ambush. Every engagement, every small victory, fueled their confidence. Morale, once fragile, was now a weapon in itself. As day turned to night, Rahimi convened a briefing with his senior officers. Maps were spread across makeshift tables. Volunteers and soldiers were assigned roles for the upcoming operation. Every unit knew their target. Every soldier, professional or volunteer, understood the plan. The counteroffensive would not be reckless. It would be precise, coordinated, and designed to hit the advancing Iraqi forces where they least expected it. Then, as darkness fell across the front lines, Rahimi's communications officer delivered a coded message. The words were simple but electrifying. Iran's first bold strike had been authorized. The moment had arrived. Volunteers and soldiers alike exchanged glances, a mix of tension and anticipation filling the air. For Reza, the message was both a signal and a challenge. After weeks of retreat, destruction, and loss, Iran was ready to fight back. The counterattack would be the culmination of months of adaptation, training, and courage. And the world, which had expected surrender, was about to witness a transformation on the battlefield that no one had predicted. Iran's forces were no longer defending, they were preparing to take the fight directly to Saddam Hussein's advancing army. The first major counteroffensive was about to begin, and its impact would ripple across the entire war. Khorramshahr burned. Smoke rose from shattered buildings, and fire streaked the skyline as Iraqi tanks rolled through the streets. The city, once bustling, had become a fortress of rubble and resistance. Saddam Hussein had believed that capturing Khorramshahr quickly would crush Iranian morale. He thought victory here would send a message: Iran was weak, fragmented, and ready to fall. He was wrong. Colonel Amir Rahimi commanded the city's defense with unmatched determination. Narrow streets, canals, ruined buildings, and collapsed bridges became tools of resistance. He organized his mixed units of volunteers and professional soldiers, using every alleyway and roof as a strategic advantage. Iraqi armored columns moved forward cautiously, aware that every block could hide an ambush. Each advance cost them tanks, men, and precious time. Reza Moradi led his unit through the wreckage, fighting house to house. Every building was a battleground. Civilians joined in, carrying ammunition, boiling water for traps, and even firearms when needed. Women and men dug makeshift trenches and reinforced walls. The volunteers' courage became contagious, inspiring soldiers to fight harder, pushing back against the advancing Iraqis. For every block lost, Iran reclaimed another through guerrilla tactics, sniper fire, and sudden counterattacks. In Baghdad, Saddam's generals grew frustrated. Losses mounted daily. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, and communication faltered under the chaos. Reports of ambushes, destroyed vehicles, and relentless Iranian resistance arrived every hour. The quick victory Saddam had promised was slipping through his fingers. Meanwhile, Inos, Farah Nazari worked around the clock in her clinic. Wounded soldiers and civilians poured in from the front lines. Every day, she stitched flesh, stopped bleeding, and kept hope alive amid unimaginable destruction. Supplies ran low, but improvisation and sheer determination kept her going. Across the globe, in Washington, Michael Turner examined satellite images of Khorramshahr. "This siege is unlike anything we've seen," he told General Sam Peterson. "Iran isn't just defending, they're preparing to push back." The battle raged for weeks. Smoke, fire, and screams filled every street. Each day brought new ambushes, artillery strikes, and firefights. Every inch of Khorramshahr became a testament to Iran's unyielding will. Iraqi forces, confident at first, now found themselves trapped in a city that fought back with strategy, courage, and determination. Then, just as Iraqi commanders believed they would finally breach the defenses, a sudden, unexpected Iranian assault struck their rear lines. Ambushes erupted, supply convoys were cut off, and panic spread through the ranks. The siege, once thought under Iraqi control, was turned upside down. Khorramshahr's defenders had shifted from defense to offense, proving that even in the face of overwhelming firepower, the human spirit could change the course of battle. A single night changed everything. The quiet desert and ruined towns of Khuzestan suddenly erupted with explosions, fire, and chaos. What had begun as small, scattered Iranian resistance now transformed into a coordinated counteroffensive. Colonel Amir Rahimi orchestrated a daring night strike aimed directly at Iraqi supply depots, communication hubs, and armored convoys. The mission was clear: disrupt, confuse, and weaken Saddam's advancing forces before they could regroup. Reza Moradi led a stealth unit through sand, rubble, and debris. Darkness concealed their movements as they approached the Iraqi rear. Every step was calculated. Every shadow could hide an enemy scout. When the first detonation ripped through a fuel depot, the night sky lit up in orange flames. Ammunition dumps exploded in succession, sending shockwaves through the desert. Iraqi trucks overturned, tanks stalled, and troops panicked as chaos spread along the supply lines. Units that had advanced confidently during the day now scrambled to find order in the darkness. Behind the front lines, Farah Nazari and her team worked tirelessly. Wounded volunteers and soldiers arrived in waves, some from ambushes, others from direct engagements. Civilians joined the effort wherever they could, carrying water, food, and makeshift medical supplies. Each life saved, each person aided, fueled the growing spirit of resistance. Hope spread rapidly among the Iranian forces, emboldening them to push further. In Baghdad, reports arrived in rapid succession. Saddam Hussein's confidence faltered as his generals begged for reinforcements. Morale among Iraqi troops plummeted. Weeks of meticulous planning, superior artillery, and armored divisions could not overcome the ingenuity, courage, and determination of Iran's defenders. Thousands of miles away, Michael Turner watched satellite images and tactical reports with astonishment. The war was no longer a one-sided invasion. Iran, once on the defensive, had become a calculated, offensive power. Small units struck with precision, coordination, and devastating effect. The tide had turned. Volunteers and soldiers, inspired by the sacrifices at Khorramshahr and the determination of ordinary citizens, fought with renewed purpose. Iranian forces were no longer just holding, they were driving back. As dawn approached, Rahimi received new intelligence. An even larger Iraqi counterstrike was forming, one that threatened to undo every hard-won victory and plunge the war into its bloodiest chapter yet. The morning sun rose over a battlefield transformed. Khorramshahr and the broader province of Khuzestan bore scars from months of relentless fighting. Streets were filled with rubble, smoke still rose from burned-out buildings, and the echoes of artillery had yet to fade. Yet amid the destruction, a new reality had emerged. Iran was no longer on the defensive, it was a force to be reckoned with. Iraqi troops were exhausted, supply lines shredded, and morale shattered. The confidence that Saddam Hussein had once displayed had been replaced by uncertainty and frustration. Colonel Amir Rahimi prepared a massive coordinated attack. This was no small operation. Infantry, volunteers, and regular soldiers moved together with tanks and artillery, each unit following precise instructions. Every strike was calculated, every advance deliberate. Rahimi's leadership ensured that volunteers who had once been untrained civilians now operated as an integrated fighting force. The coordination of men, vehicles, and artillery created a pressure point along Iraqi positions, leaving them vulnerable to continuous strikes. Reza Moradi, now a seasoned veteran, fought with renewed determination. Each skirmish, each ambush, and every engagement carried weight. He understood that the survival of his homeland depended on the discipline, courage, and resilience of every fighter around him. Iran's forces, once scattered and disorganized, now moved like a single, unified force. The Iraqi army struggled to regroup. Convoys were delayed by ambushes. Tanks were destroyed in well-laid traps. Every advance met with resistance. The war that Saddam had promised would end in days had transformed into a nightmare of chaos, attrition, and retreat. His quick victory was gone. Behind the lines, Farah Nazari continued her work tirelessly. Her clinic had become a hub for courage and resilience. Civilians, once paralyzed with fear, now provided food, medical aid, and support to the fighters. Ordinary citizens had become an extraordinary force. Across the globe, Michael Turner monitored the situation from Washington. Satellite images and field reports confirmed what analysts had long suspected. Iran had rewritten the rules of engagement. What had begun as a chaotic defense had turned into an unstoppable counteroffensive. Momentum had shifted irreversibly. The battle had proven that courage, strategy, and unity could defy even the most powerful invader. The world would remember the strength of a people fighting for their homeland. History teaches the value of resilience, the power of unity, and the impact of ordinary people rising against overwhelming odds. Study these events closely. Understand the courage and strategy involved. Apply these lessons to your own life. Stand firm in your beliefs, prepare for challenges with determination, and never underestimate the influence of collective effort. Learn from the past to inspire meaningful action today and shape a future defined by courage and commitment.